Hi everyone, tonight's story takes us far back to the rugged hills of ancient Sparta, where boys were taught to be fearless, to endure, and to never yield. If you love atmospheric, slow-burn storytelling, make sure to like and subscribe. It really helps this channel grow. And write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. It's always a joy to see people joining from all over the world. Now, switch off the lights, maybe keep just one candle, or the soft glow of your screen, and let's step into the shadows of history together. There are stones in Sparta that remember more than men do. They have stood beneath the sun longer than any of us drew breath, and they shall remain when the last name spoken in our tongue has faded into silence. I have returned to them now, in the winter of my years, and I place my hand upon their surface as I once did when I was a child, before I understood what it meant to become what Sparta required. The courtyard is empty today. The wind moves through it as it always has, carrying with it the scent of dust and wild thyme from the hills beyond. I stand here, and I am both the man I have become and the boy I once was. Memory is a strange companion. It does not ask permission to arrive, nor does it announce its departure. It simply places before you the shape of things long past, and you must decide whether to turn away or to look upon them once more. I look upon them now. I see the training ground as it was then, in those years when the world seemed made entirely of stone and bronze, and the voices of men who knew no mercy. The earth was hard beneath our feet, baked by summer and frozen by winter, and it gave nothing freely. We learned to take from it what we needed, or we learned that we were not strong enough to remain. Would you have endured it, if it were you? I ask this not to judge, but because I have asked it of myself 10,000 times, and I have never found an answer that satisfies. Perhaps there is no answer. Perhaps there is only the fact of it, the lived truth of those years, which no amount of questioning can undo or explain. I was 7 years old when they came for me. My mother knew the day before it happened. I saw it in her face at dawn, in the way she moved about our small dwelling as though each gesture were a farewell. She prepared the morning meal with unusual care, and she watched me eat with eyes that seemed to be committing the sight to some deep chamber of memory. I did not understand then what I understand now, that she was preparing herself for a separation that would be more complete than the one granted by distance alone. The sun had barely risen when the elder appeared at our threshold. He was not unkind, but neither was he gentle. Kindness and gentleness had no place in what he had come to do. He stood in the doorway, a figure carved from the same stone as the city itself, and he spoke the words that every Spartan mother heard and every Spartan mother dreaded. The time had come. I was to be taken to the agoge. My mother did not weep. Spartan women did not weep at such moments, or if they did, they wept where no one could see. She placed her hand upon my head, and I felt the weight of it, the warmth of her palm against my hair. She said nothing. There was nothing to say. The state had spoken, and the state's word was final. I remember looking up at her face, trying to read in it some instruction, some guidance for what was to come. But her expression was set, composed, a mask of dignity that revealed nothing of what moved beneath. She had been preparing for this moment since the day of my birth. Every Spartan mother prepared for it. The city demanded its children, and the mothers gave them up, because that was the covenant made long before any of us were born. The elder gestured, and I followed. I did not look back. Even at 7 years old, I understood that to look back would be to dishonor the woman who had raised me. She had given me to Sparta, and Sparta would make of me what it would. That was the way of things. We walked through the streets in the early light, past the low stone houses and the temples where incense smoke rose into the pale sky. Other boys walked with us, collected from their homes as I had been collected from mine. We were silent, all of us. We had not yet learned the discipline of silence that would be beaten into us in the years to come, but we were silent nonetheless, struck dumb by the strangeness of the morning and the finality of what was happening. The training ground lay at the edge of the city, a wide expanse of packed earth surrounded by buildings of rough stone. There were already boys there, older than us, their bodies lean and hard from years of training. They watched us arrive with expressions that told us nothing, and we stood in a ragged line whilst the elder who had brought us spoke to another man, a figure of greater authority, whose presence seemed to draw the very light towards him. This was the Paidonomos, the one who would oversee our training, the one whose word would be law for the years to come. He looked upon us as a farmer might look upon new livestock, assessing our worth, measuring what use might be made of us. Some of us would prove strong, some would not. That was not his concern. His concern was to break us down and rebuild us in the image that Sparta required. He spoke. His voice was not loud, but it carried across the courtyard with perfect clarity. He told us that we were no longer children of our mothers. We were children of the state. We belonged to Sparta now, and Sparta would shape us as it saw fit. If we proved worthy, we would become warriors, defenders of the polis, bearers of the red cloak and the bronze shield. If we proved unworthy, we would be cast aside, our names forgotten, our existence erased from the memory of the city. There was no room for weakness in Sparta. There was no mercy for those who could not endure. We would be tested every day, in every way, and those tests would reveal what we truly were beneath the soft flesh of childhood. He finished speaking, and we were led to the barracks where we would sleep. The building was long and low, with a roof of timber and walls of stone. Inside, the air was cool and dim, and there were sleeping pallets arranged in rows along the floor. We were assigned our places, and we stood beside them, uncertain, waiting for instruction. An older boy, perhaps 14 or 15 years of age, stepped forwards. His body bore the marks of training, the lean muscle, the scarred hands, the sun-darkened skin. He looked at us with something that might have been pity or might have been contempt. It was difficult to tell. He told us to remove our clothing and place it in the corner of the room. From this moment onwards, we would wear only the single tunic provided by the state, a rough garment of undyed wool that fell to the knee. We would be given no shoes. We would be given no cloak except in the depths of winter. We would learn to endure heat and cold, hunger and thirst, pain and exhaustion, because these were the conditions of life for a Spartan warrior. We did as we were told. We stood naked in that dim room, 7 years old, already being stripped of everything we had known. The older boy distributed the tunics, one to each of us, and we pulled them on, feeling the rough wool against our skin. It was coarse, unpleasant, but we said nothing. We were learning already that to speak was to invite correction. The day's training began immediately. There was no period of adjustment, no gradual introduction to the demands of the agoge. We were taken to the courtyard and made to run. We ran in circles around the perimeter of the training ground, our bare feet slapping against the hard earth, the sun climbing higher and hotter overhead. When one of us faltered, an older boy struck him across the shoulders with a length of leather, and the fallen one rose and continued running. We ran until our legs trembled. We ran until our lungs burned. We ran until we could no longer remember a time when we had not been running. And when we finally stopped, when we collapsed upon the ground, gasping and shaking, we were given water from a communal jar and told to drink sparingly. Water was not limitless. We would learn to need less of it. The rest of that first day passed in a haze of exhaustion and confusion. We were taught the proper way to stand, the proper way to walk, the proper way to hold our bodies, so that every movement conveyed strength and discipline. We were taught to respond to commands instantly, without hesitation, without thought. We were taught that our lives were no longer our own, that we existed now only as extensions of the state's will. As evening fell, we were given our first meal. It was a thin broth made from barley and a handful of greens, served in wooden bowls. We ate in silence, sitting cross-legged on the ground, and we were watched by the older boys to ensure that we did not take more than our share. The food was barely sufficient to ease the ache of hunger in our bellies, and we understood that this too was intentional. We would be kept always on the edge of hunger, so that we would learn to steal food without being caught, to forage for ourselves, to become resourceful and cunning. When the meal was finished, we were led back to the barracks. The sun had set, and the air had grown cold. We lay down upon our pallets, which were nothing more than thin reeds covered with a single blanket, and we tried to sleep. But sleep did not come easily. The cold seeped into our bones and the strangeness of the place, the absence of our mothers, the weight of what lay ahead, All these things kept us wakeful and afraid. I lay there in the darkness, listening to the breathing of the other boys, and I wondered if I would survive this. I wondered if I was strong enough, brave enough, hard enough to become what Sparta demanded. I had no answer. I had only the darkness and the cold and the slow, inexorable approach of dawn, which would bring with it another day of trials. That first night seemed to last forever, and yet when morning came, it felt as though no time had passed at all. We were roused before the sun had risen, pulled from our pallets by the older boys, and driven out into the courtyard where the air was sharp with the chill of early morning. We stood there, shivering in our thin tunics, and we were told that this was how every day would begin, in darkness and cold, with our bodies not yet ready but forced to become so. Thus began my years in the agoge. Thus began the transformation from child to weapon, from soft flesh to hardened bronze, from individual will to collective purpose. I did not know it then, but I would spend the next 13 years in that place, and when I finally emerged, I would be unrecognizable even to myself. The days developed a rhythm, though rhythm is perhaps too gentle a word for what we experienced. It was more like the beating of a drum, relentless and unyielding, marking time in units of pain and endurance. Each dawn brought the same awakening, the same harsh voices dragging us from whatever brief oblivion we had found in sleep. We learned to rise instantly, to be on our feet before we were fully conscious, because to be slow was to invite the leather reminder across our backs. The mornings were devoted to physical training. We ran through the hills beyond the city, following paths that seemed designed to inflict maximum suffering. The ground was uneven, scattered with sharp stones that cut our feet, and we learned to place each step with care even as we maintained our pace. The older boys ran with us, watching for any sign of weakness, any faltering of stride or laboured breathing that might indicate a boy who was not fit to continue. I remember the taste of those morning runs, the metallic tang of exertion in my mouth, the way my lungs seemed to shrink with each breath until I was certain I could draw no more air. But I did draw more air, and I kept running, because the alternative was unthinkable. To stop was to be marked as weak, and weakness in Sparta was a burden that no one could afford to carry. After the running came the wrestling. We were paired with boys of similar size and told to grapple until one of us could pin the other to the ground. There was no instruction in technique, no careful teaching of holds and throws. We learned by doing, by feeling the weight of another body against our own, by discovering which movements created advantage and which created vulnerability. The ground became our teacher, and we learned its lessons through bruises and scraped skin and the dull ache of joints twisted beyond their accustomed range. Some boys took to wrestling naturally, their bodies seeming to understand instinctively how to use leverage and balance. Others struggled, and I was among those who struggled. I was not the smallest in my group, but neither was I the largest, and I lacked the natural aggression that made some boys fearsome opponents. I had to learn to compensate, to use quickness where I lacked strength, to anticipate my opponent's movements and counter them before they were fully executed. The older boys watched our wrestling matches with critical eyes, and occasionally one would step forwards and demonstrate a technique, throwing a boy to the ground with such casual efficiency that it seemed almost gentle. But there was nothing gentle about the demonstration. It was a lesson in how much more we had to learn, how far we were from the competence that Sparta required. We wrestled until our bodies were covered in dust and sweat, until we could barely lift our arms, and then we were told to clean ourselves at the communal washing area. This was little more than a stone basin filled with cold water, and we took turns splashing the dust from our skin and hair. There was no soap, no luxury of any kind. We learned to be clean with water alone, and we learned to be quick about it, because time spent washing was time stolen from other duties. The midday meal was the same as the evening meal had been, thin broth and a small portion of bread. We ate quickly, sitting in rows on the ground, and we did not speak. Silence during meals was not merely encouraged but enforced. The meal was fuel for the body, nothing more, and to treat it as an occasion for pleasure or conversation was to misunderstand its purpose. I was hungry always in those early years. The portions we were given were calculated to keep us just below the point of satisfaction, to maintain in us a constant awareness of need. This was deliberate. We were meant to supplement our rations through stealth, to steal food from the kitchens or from the fields beyond the city. And if we were caught, we were punished not for stealing, but for being clumsy enough to be discovered. This was one of the first lessons of Spartan training, that cunning and resourcefulness were as important as strength and endurance. A warrior needed to be able to survive in hostile territory, to feed himself when no supplies were available, to move unseen through enemy lands. So, we learned to steal, and we learned to move in silence, and we learned that the world would give us nothing unless we took it. The afternoons were given over to the learning of weapons. We began with staves, long poles of hardwood that served as substitutes for the spears we would one day carry. We were taught the basic movements, the thrust and parry, the proper stance that would allow us to deliver force without losing balance. The training was repetitive, hours spent executing the same motion again and again until it became automatic, until our bodies knew what to do without instruction from our minds. The staves were heavy, and our arms ached from holding them extended. But we held them nonetheless, because to lower the staff before commanded to do so was to invite correction. The older boys walked among us as we trained, observing our form, striking us with their own staves when our stance was wrong or our grip inadequate. These strikes were not gentle. They left marks that lasted for days, dark bruises that reminded us of our failures. I learned to hold the staff properly through trial and error, through countless corrections and countless bruises. My arms grew stronger from the effort, my shoulders broader, my hands calloused from gripping the rough wood. The staff became an extension of my body, a tool that I wielded with increasing confidence as the weeks passed. But confidence was dangerous. Confidence led to carelessness, and carelessness led to defeat. We learned this through combat drills, where we were pitted against one another with our staves, and told to strike as though our lives depended upon it. These were not gentle exercises. We struck with full force, and we were struck with full force in return, and we learned what it meant to receive a blow that knocked the breath from our lungs or sent us sprawling to the ground. Pain became familiar. It was a constant presence, a companion that never left us. Our bodies were always aching, always marked with fresh injuries atop old ones. We learned to ignore the pain, to function despite it, to push our bodies beyond the point where they wanted to stop. This was perhaps the most important lesson of all, that the body's protest could be overridden by the will, that suffering was temporary but failure was permanent. As the seasons changed, the training intensified. Winter brought cold that seeped into our bones and made every movement an effort. We were still given only our single tunics, and we learned to generate warmth through constant motion, to keep our blood flowing so that we did not succumb to the chill. Some boys developed sores on their feet from the frozen ground, wounds that refused to heal in the harsh conditions. These boys continued training nonetheless, because there was no provision for rest, no acknowledgement that injury might require time to recover. I watched boys sicken during that first winter. I watched their strength fade, their movements become sluggish, their faces take on a grey pallor that spoke of bodies pushed beyond their limits. Some of these boys recovered, others did not. Those who did not were removed from the barracks one morning, and we did not see them again. Their pallets were taken away, their places filled by new boys, and their names were not spoken. It was as though they had never existed at all. This was how we learned about the cost of weakness, not through lectures or warnings, but through absence, through the gaps left by those who had been unable to endure. We understood, without needing to be told, that the same fate awaited any of us who proved insufficient. There was no safety in the agoge, no guarantee of survival. We earned our continuation day by day, through the demonstration of strength and the suppression of weakness. Spring brought different challenges. The warmth returned, and with it came longer training days and new forms of ordeal. We were taken into the hills for exercises that lasted from dawn until long after dark, marching with heavy packs, navigating terrain that seemed designed to break ankles and twist knees. We learned to move quickly over uneven ground, to maintain formation even when exhausted, to respond to commands even when every fibre of our beings wanted to collapse. The hills of Sparta are not gentle. They rise steeply from the valley floor, covered with scrub brush and loose stone, and they offer no mercy to those who climb them. We climbed them repeatedly, racing against one another, driven by the older boys who seemed never to tire. When we reached the summit, we were not given time to rest. We were sent immediately back down, and then up again until our legs trembled with exhaustion and our vision blurred. I fell many times during those hill runs. The ground rose up to meet me with brutal force, and I tasted dirt and felt the sharp pain of impact. But I rose each time, because to remain on the ground was to be left behind, and to be left behind was to acknowledge defeat. I learned to fall properly, to protect my head and roll with the momentum so that I could regain my feet quickly. This was not a skill anyone taught me. It was something I discovered through necessity, through the repeated experience of falling and rising, until my body knew how to do it without thought. By the end of my first year in the agoge, I was no longer the boy who had been taken from his mother's dwelling. My body had changed, become leaner and harder, my muscles visible beneath the skin in ways they had not been before. My feet were so calloused that I barely felt the stones beneath them. My hands were rough and scarred from gripping weapons and climbing ropes and grappling with other boys. My face had lost the softness of childhood, the cheeks hollowing, the jaw becoming more prominent. But the changes were not merely physical. Something within me had shifted as well, some fundamental alteration in how I understood the world and my place in it. I had learned that suffering was inevitable, that comfort was an illusion, that strength was the only currency that mattered. I'd learned to suppress fear, to push through exhaustion, to endure pain without complaint. I'd learned, in short, to become Spartan. Yet, even as I changed, I remained aware that this was only the beginning. I was still among the youngest in the agoge, still soft compared to the older boys who had years more training than I did. They were what I would become if I survived. They were the image of the future that awaited me, a future of unrelenting discipline and constant testing, where each day brought new trials and each trial demanded more than the one before. There was an order to everything in the agoge, a structure as rigid as the stone walls that surrounded us. Every action had its proper form, every moment its designated purpose. We learned this order through repetition and through the consequences that followed deviation from it. The consequences were swift and certain, applied without anger but without mercy either. They were not meant to humiliate us but to instruct us, to carve into our bodies and minds the understanding that discipline was the foundation upon which all else was built. The leather reminder was the most common instrument of correction. It was a strap perhaps as long as a man's forearm, cut from hide that had been hardened through use. The older boys carried these straps always, and they applied them whenever they witnessed behaviour that fell short of what was expected. A boy who moved too slowly received the strap across his shoulders. A boy who spoke out of turn received it across his back. A boy who showed fear or hesitation received it until the fear was driven out, or the boy himself was driven away. I felt that leather many times in my early years. The sensation is difficult to describe to one who has not experienced it. The sharp crack as it struck, the line of fire that blazed across the skin, the way the pain seemed to radiate outwards from the point of impact. But worse than the immediate sensation was the knowledge that another strike might follow, and another after that, until the correction was deemed complete. We learned not to cry out when struck. To make sound was to reveal weakness, and weakness invited further correction. So we learned to accept the blows in silence, to keep our faces composed, to show nothing of what we felt. This was harder than any physical exercise, this suppression of natural response, this denial of the body's desire to flinch or retreat. But we mastered it, because we had to. There were other forms of correction as well, subtler perhaps, but no less effective. A boy who failed at his tasks might be denied his evening meal, sent to his pallet hungry whilst his companions ate. A boy who showed poor form in weapons training might be made to hold his staff extended until his arms trembled and gave out, and then made to hold it longer still. A boy who demonstrated cowardice might be placed at the front of every formation, where danger would find him first, until he learned either courage or departed from among us. The punishments were calibrated to the offence, but they were never gentle, never lenient. Sparta had no use for mercy. Mercy made warriors weak, made them hesitant when decisiveness was required. So we learned to expect no mercy, to ask for none, to give none to ourselves. We learned that the world was hard and that we had to be harder still. I remember a boy named Telamon who failed to complete a hill run. He had pushed himself to exhaustion and beyond, but his body finally rebelled, his legs giving out halfway up the slope. He lay there on the ground, unable to rise, his chest heaving with the effort to draw breath. The older boy who was leading our group stood over him for a moment, watching, and then delivered a series of strikes with the leather reminder, each one landing precisely across Telamon's shoulders and back. Telamon made no sound. He took the blows in silence, and when they ceased, he struggled to his feet and completed the climb. His face was grey with exhaustion, his movements uncertain, but he finished what had been demanded of him. That night, he was given no food, and he lay on his pallet shaking with fatigue and hunger. I saw him the next morning, rising with the rest of us, ready to begin another day of training, despite everything his body had endured the day before. This was the nature of discipline in Sparta. It was not cruel for the sake of cruelty, but neither did it acknowledge the concept of reasonable limits. The limits were wherever each boy found them, and then pushed beyond them, and beyond them again, until either the boy broke through to new capacity or the boy himself was broken. Some were broken. I do not know how many, because those who failed to endure simply disappeared, their pallets emptied, their names unspoken. But I saw enough to understand that the agoge sorted us with ruthless efficiency, separating those who could be forged into warriors from those who could not. There was no shame attached to those who were removed, but neither was there sympathy. They had proven insufficient, and Sparta had no place for the insufficient. We learned to police ourselves as well, to maintain discipline even when the older boys were not watching. We corrected one another's failures, held one another accountable to the standards that had been set for us. This was not because we were cruel, but because we understood that weakness in one threatened all. If a boy could not keep pace, the entire group suffered. If a boy could not maintain silence, the entire group was punished. So we learned to depend upon one another, even as we competed with one another, a paradox that somehow made perfect sense within the strange logic of Spartan training. There was a particular punishment reserved for theft poorly executed. If a boy was caught stealing food, he was brought before the group and given extra portions of the leather reminder, not for stealing, but for allowing himself to be discovered. Then he was made to watch whilst his rations for the next 3 days were distributed among the other boys. He would go hungry, learning through the gnawing in his belly that competence was not optional, that failure in even small things carried consequences that extended beyond the moment. I was caught once, in my second year. I had attempted to take bread from the kitchen during the night, moving carefully through the shadows, certain that I had not been observed. But one of the older boys had been watching, testing us, and he caught me as I emerged with my prize. The beating that followed was thorough and methodical, and then I was brought before my group and made to surrender the bread I had stolen along with my own rations for the next 3 days. Those 3 days were among the hardest I had yet experienced. Training continued as always, the same demands placed upon my body, but I had no food to fuel the effort. I felt my strength waning, felt the hollow ache in my belly growing deeper, felt the edges of my vision darkening with exhaustion. But I endured, because that was what was required. And when the 3 days were finished, I was given my rations again, as though nothing had happened. I never allowed myself to be caught stealing again. I became more careful, more patient, more attentive to the patterns of the older boys and the rhythms of the kitchen staff. I learned to move in absolute silence, to become part of the shadows, to take only what I could conceal and carry without being noticed. And I was successful, because I had learned the lesson that punishment was meant to teach, that skill was not optional, that survival required constant vigilance and perfect execution. The discipline extended beyond physical correction to every aspect of our existence. We were taught to speak sparingly, to use words only when necessary, to find other means of communication when words would be wasteful. Silence was valued in Sparta above almost all other virtues. A warrior who could not control his tongue could not be trusted to control himself in battle. where a cry or command given at the wrong moment might mean the difference between victory and annihilation. We learned to convey meaning through gesture and expression, through the subtle movements of hand or tilt of head that other Spartans understood instinctively. We learned to read the faces of our instructors and commanders, to anticipate their wishes before they were spoken, to respond to intent rather than explicit command. This made us efficient, precise, economical in all our actions, but it also made us isolated, each of us locked within ourselves, unable or unwilling to give voice to what we felt or thought. We became, in a sense, living weapons, instruments of the state's will, our individual desires and fears, suppressed beneath layers of discipline and training. Whether this was a necessary transformation or a kind of violence done to our essential selves, I cannot say even now. I know only that it was accomplished, and that by the end of my 3rd year in the agoge, I spoke perhaps a dozen words in an average day, and some days I spoke none at all. The rituals of punishment were supplemented by rituals of another kind, designed to honor the gods and bind us to the spiritual traditions of our city. We were taken regularly to the temple of Artemis Orthia, where we participated in ceremonies that tested our endurance and proved our worthiness to the goddess. These ceremonies involved ordeals whose nature I shall describe only in outline, for they were sacred and secret, meant for Spartan eyes alone. We stood before the altar whilst the priests performed their rites, and we were called forward one by one to demonstrate our capacity to endure without flinching, without sound, without any sign that might suggest weakness or fear. The goddess watched through the eyes of her priestesses, and she judged us, and those who passed her judgment were marked as having received her favour. Those who failed were not marked at all, and their failure was noted by all who witnessed it. I passed the ordeal, though the memory of it remains with me still, etched into my body and mind with the same permanence as the marks it left upon my flesh. I stood before that altar, and I felt the eyes of the goddess upon me, felt the weight of her scrutiny, and I understood that I was being measured against a standard that had existed long before I was born, and would continue long after I had returned to the earth. I did not flinch. I did not cry out. I remained still and silent, and when it was finished, I walked from the temple with my head high, knowing that I had proven myself worthy of the name Spartan. These rituals bound us to something larger than ourselves, gave us a sense of purpose that transcended mere survival. We were not simply enduring hardship for the sake of hardship. We were being prepared for a sacred duty, the defense of our city and our way of life against all who would threaten it. The gods themselves had ordained this path, had set before us the standard we must meet, and to fail was not merely personal weakness but a betrayal of the divine will. So we trained, and we endured, and we accepted the discipline that was imposed upon us, because we understood that it was necessary, that it was transforming us into something greater than we had been. We were being stripped of softness, of sentiment, of all the comfortable illusions that other peoples clung to. We were being reduced to our essential elements, and then rebuilt according to a design that had proven itself across generations. Could you have borne it? Could you have stood beneath that weight day after day, year after year, never knowing rest, never granted mercy, never allowed to be anything less than what Sparta demanded? I do not ask to boast of my own endurance, for I was only one among many, and there were those who endured far more with far less complaint than I. I ask because I want you to understand what we were, what we became, and what was required to achieve that becoming. We were children when we entered the agoge, soft and ignorant and weak. We emerged as men who knew no softness, who had forgotten what it meant to live without discipline, who measured themselves always against the higher standard and found themselves wanting and pushed themselves higher still. This transformation did not happen gently. It happened through 10,000 small ordeals, 10,000 corrections, 10,000 moments when we wanted to surrender, but chose instead to endure. And so the years passed, each one building upon the one before, each one adding new layers of skill and hardness and understanding. We grew taller, stronger, more capable. Our bodies became instruments of war, honed and perfected through endless repetition. Our minds became sharp and focused, capable of remaining calm in circumstances that would have broken lesser men. We became, slowly and painfully, what Sparta had always intended us to be. There is a bond that forms between those who suffer together, a connection deeper than friendship, stranger than kinship. In the agoge, we learned this bond without learning its name. We did not speak of it, for we spoke of little, but we felt it nonetheless, in the moments when exhaustion had stripped away everything except the shared fact of our endurance. We were not encouraged to form attachments. Individual loyalty was suspect in Sparta, where all allegiance belonged to the state. Yet the nature of our training made isolation impossible. We lived together, slept side by side on our thin pallets, ate from the same communal pot, endured the same trials and corrections. Our fates were bound together whether we wished them to be or not. I came to know the boys in my group not through conversation but through observation, through the 1,000 small details that revealed character when words could not. There was Nicias, who never complained no matter how severe the ordeal, whose face remained composed even when the leather fell across his back. There was Aristodemus, quick and clever, who could steal food with such skill that even the older boys grudgingly acknowledged his competence. There was Polemarchus, large for his age, whose strength made him formidable in wrestling, but whose gentleness, barely concealed, marked him as different from the rest of us. We did not choose one another as companions. We were thrown together by the accident of age and arrival, and we learned to function as a unit because our survival depended upon it. When one of us faltered during a hill run, the others would position themselves around him, shielding him from the older boy's observation, allowing him to recover his strength without being marked as weak. When one of us was denied food as punishment, the others would share their portions, passing morsels in darkness when no one watched, ensuring that no one among us would fail from simple hunger. These acts of solidarity were never acknowledged openly. To do so would have been to invite correction for placing individual loyalty above the collective good. But they happened nonetheless. Small rebellions against the harsh logic that governed our lives, assertions of our humanity in a system designed to strip humanity away. There was a night, I remember, when Nicias fell ill. We were in our 4th year then, old enough to understand what illness might mean in the agoge. A boy who could not train was a boy who might not recover, might be judged insufficient and removed. Nicias lay on his pallet with fever burning through him, his body shaking despite the blanket we had placed over him, and we knew that if the older boys discovered his condition, he might disappear, as others had disappeared before him. So we concealed it. When the morning came and we were roused for training, we pulled Nicias to his feet and supported him between us as we walked to the courtyard. During the exercises, we positioned ourselves so that he could lean upon us without being obvious, so that his weakness would be hidden within our collective strength. When he stumbled during the running, we caught him and pushed him forward, our bodies creating a barrier between him and the older boys who watched for signs of failure. We did this for 3 days, until the fever broke and Nicias could stand on his own again. He never thanked us, because to thank us would have been to acknowledge what had happened, and acknowledgement would have endangered us all. But something changed between us after that, a deepening of the unspoken bond that already existed. We had risked ourselves for him, and he knew it, and we knew that he would do the same for any of us if the need arose. This was the paradox of Spartan training. We were taught to be self-reliant, to depend upon no one, to find strength within ourselves alone. Yet the structure of the agoge made mutual dependence inevitable. We could not survive alone. We needed one another, even as we competed with one another, even as we were taught that individual attachment was weakness. The older boys understood this paradox, I think, though they never spoke of it directly. They structured our training so that we would learn both independence and cooperation, both self-sufficiency and collective action. When we marched in formation, each of us had to maintain his own pace, whilst also matching the pace of those around him. When we fought with shields, each man protected not only himself, but the man beside him, the shield wall functioning only when every warrior trusted his companions to hold their positions. We learned these lessons slowly, through years of repetition and adjustment. We learned to anticipate one another's movements, to compensate for one another's weaknesses, to function as a single organism, despite being composed of many separate wills. This was the foundation of Spartan military prowess, this ability to act as one whilst remaining individually capable. But the cost of this unity was high. We learned not to grieve when one of our number disappeared, because grief was attachment, and attachment was weakness. We learned not to speak of those who were gone, because to speak of them was to acknowledge that they had mattered, and in Sparta, only the collective mattered. Individual lives were expendable in service of the greater whole. I watched boys vanish from our ranks, boys I had trained beside for years, and I felt their absence like wounds that would not heal. But I showed nothing of what I felt. I continued training, continued enduring, continued becoming what Sparta required, and gradually the wounds stopped aching, or perhaps I simply grew accustomed to the ache, so that it became part of the background of existence, noticed no more than the constant hunger or the endless exhaustion. Polemarchus was the first of our group to be sent away. It happened in our 5th year, after an exercise where we were made to fight in pairs with real spears, their points dulled, but still capable of causing injury. Polemarchus was matched against a boy from another group, a smaller boy but quick and vicious, and the fight did not go well. Polemarchus hesitated, his gentleness asserting itself at the crucial moment, and the other boy struck him repeatedly, driving him back, finally knocking him to the ground. The older boy, who supervised the exercise, watched this with an expression of profound disappointment. After the fight ended, he called Polemarchus forward and spoke to him quietly, too quietly for the rest of us to hear. Polemarchus's face drained of colour, but he nodded, accepting whatever judgment had been pronounced. The next morning, his pallet was empty, and we did not see him again. I missed him, though I could never have said so aloud. He had been kind in small ways, sharing food when he managed to steal extra, helping younger boys with their training when the older boys were not watching. His gentleness had seemed like weakness to our instructors, but to those of us who knew him, it had been a different kind of strength, a refusal to let the agoge strip away his humanity entirely. But Sparta had no use for that kind of strength. Sparta needed warriors who would kill without hesitation, who would drive their spears into enemy flesh without the burden of conscience or compassion. Polemarchus could not be that kind of warrior, and so he was removed, sent away to whatever fate awaited those who were judged insufficient. After his departure, the rest of us grew harder, more careful about revealing anything that might be interpreted as weakness. We understood that we were always being evaluated, always being tested, and that failure could come at any moment without warning. So we maintained our discipline, kept our faces composed, showed nothing of the fear or doubt or sorrow that moved beneath the surface. Yet the bonds between us persisted, growing stronger, even as we grew more careful about concealing them. We developed a silent language, a system of gestures and glances that allowed us to communicate without words. A slight nod might mean support or encouragement. A particular stance might warn of an instructor's approach. A certain look might convey shared understanding of some difficulty or shared satisfaction at some small victory. These subtle communications were our rebellion against the isolation that Sparta sought to impose. They were our assertion that we remained human despite everything, that beneath the hardened exterior, we were still capable of connection, still capable of caring what happened to one another. We gave nothing away to our instructors, but among ourselves, in the spaces between their observation, we maintained a community that sustained us through the worst of what we endured. There were moments when this community revealed itself fully, moments when the facade of Spartan indifference cracked to show what lay beneath. I remember an evening after a particularly brutal day of training, when we had been pushed beyond exhaustion into a realm where the body continues moving only because the mind refuses to acknowledge its right to stop. We returned to the barracks barely able to walk, and we collapsed upon our pallets without even attempting to wash. As I lay there in the darkness, unable to sleep despite my exhaustion, I heard someone weeping. The sound was quiet, muffled, but unmistakable. Someone among us had finally reached the point where the pain could no longer be contained. I did not know who it was, and I did not try to discover. But I heard others stirring, heard the soft sounds of movement, and I knew that whoever was weeping was being comforted, that hands were being placed upon shoulders, that the unspoken support of the group was being offered. No one spoke. No one acknowledged what was happening, but in that moment, we were bound together more completely than at any other time I could remember. We were brothers in suffering, and that brotherhood mattered more than all the discipline and training and ideology that Sparta had imposed upon us. The next morning, we rose as always, showed no sign of what had passed in the night, and continued our training. But something had shifted, some recognition that beneath our hardness, we remained capable of compassion, capable of acknowledging one another's pain even if we could do nothing to ease it. In our 7th year, when we had reached the age of 14, we were taken into the wilderness for the test that separated those who would become full warriors from those who would not. This was the Cryptia, the secret time, when we would be sent alone into the hills with nothing but a knife, and told to survive for 30 days without being captured or forced to return. We were prepared for this test through years of training, years of learning to endure hunger and cold, to move silently through difficult terrain to steal what we needed and remain unseen. But preparation and actual experience are different things, and as the time approached, I felt something I had not felt in years, something that the agoge had nearly succeeded in beating out of me. Fear. We were taken to the edge of the wilderness in the dark hours before dawn, each of us led separately to a different location, so that we would not know where the others had been placed. The older boy who led me through the darkness said nothing during our journey, and I asked no questions. When we reached the place where I was to be left, he handed me a small knife, the blade worn but sharp, and he looked at me for a long moment. Then he turned and walked away, and I was alone. The silence of the wilderness is different from the silence of the training ground. On the training ground, silence is imposed, maintained through discipline and the threat of punishment. In the wilderness, silence simply exists, a vast emptiness broken only by the wind moving through the scrub brush and the distant call of night birds. I stood there in the darkness, listening to that silence, and I felt the weight of my aloneness settle upon me like a physical burden. I had 30 days to survive. 30 days without shelter, without regular food, without the structure that had governed every moment of my existence for the past 7 years. 30 days to prove that I could function independently, that I had absorbed the lessons of the agoge so completely that they had become part of my nature. The first challenge was finding water. I knew the general direction of the nearest stream, and I moved towards it carefully, placing each foot with precision, avoiding loose stones that might shift beneath my weight. The darkness was absolute, the moon having not yet risen, and I had to rely upon touch and hearing rather than sight. But I had been trained for this. My feet had learned to read the ground, to distinguish between stable earth and treacherous footing, and I moved with confidence despite the darkness. I reached the stream as the first grey light of dawn began to seep into the sky. The water was cold and clear, flowing down from the mountains, and I drank deeply, feeling it ease the dryness in my throat. Then I moved away from the stream, knowing that water sources would be watched by the hunters who had been sent to test us, older warriors whose task was to capture any boy they could find. I spent the first day finding shelter, a small cave formed by an overhang of rock, barely large enough for me to lie down but adequate for my needs. I gathered dry grass and small branches to create a bed that would keep me off the cold ground, and I concealed the entrance with brush so that anyone passing would not immediately notice the opening. Hunger came quickly. I had been kept on short rations for years, but there had always been something, the thin broth and bread that kept the worst of starvation at bay. Now there was nothing except what I could find or steal, and finding food in the wilderness required patience and skill that I was only beginning to develop. I searched for the foods we had been taught to recognize, the edible plants that grew wild in the hills, the roots that could be dug up and eaten raw or roasted over a small fire. But it was the wrong season for many of these plants, and what I found was barely sufficient to ease the gnawing in my belly. I needed more substantial food, and that meant stealing from the farms and villages that dotted the edges of the wilderness. I waited until nightfall before attempting my first theft. I had observed a small farm during the day, noting the positions of the buildings, the movements of the inhabitants, the presence of dogs that might raise alarm. When darkness fell, I approached carefully, moving with the patience of a hunter, taking long minutes to cover short distances, freezing at every sound that might indicate discovery. The farm had a small garden, and I took vegetables from it, pulling them carefully from the earth, wiping the dirt away as best I could. I also found bread cooling on a windowsill, and I took that as well, knowing that the theft would be noticed but unable to resist the need that drove me. Then I retreated into the darkness, moving quickly once I was clear of the farm, not stopping until I had put significant distance between myself and the site of my theft. I ate some of the food immediately, unable to help myself, the bread and vegetables tasting better than anything I could remember. But I forced myself to save the rest, to ration it so that it would last several days. Hunger makes one foolish, makes one want to consume everything immediately. But I had learned discipline, and I applied it now, eating only enough to ease the worst of the craving. The days developed a rhythm. I spent the mornings and evenings searching for food, either foraging in the wilderness or stealing from farms when opportunity presented itself. I spent the midday hours resting in my shelter, conserving energy, listening for sounds that might indicate the approach of hunters. At night, I sometimes ventured closer to the villages, observing the movements of people, learning the patterns that governed their lives. I saw other boys occasionally, glimpses of movement in the distance that might have been my companions from the agoge. But we never approached one another, never acknowledged each other's presence. We were alone in this test, and to join forces would have been to defeat its purpose. We had to prove individual capability, individual worth, and that could only be accomplished in isolation. The hunters came for me on the 12th day. I had grown perhaps too confident, too comfortable with my routine, and I made the mistake of returning to the same farm twice. They had been watching, waiting for such a mistake, and when I emerged from the garden with stolen food, they were there. I ran. Instinct took over, and I fled into the darkness, moving as quickly as I dared over the uneven ground. I could hear them behind me, their footsteps steady and relentless, and I knew that they were more experienced than I was, better at reading the terrain, capable of maintaining pursuit longer than I could maintain flight. But I had one advantage. I was smaller, lighter, able to fit through spaces they could not easily navigate. I led them into the roughest terrain I could find, areas where the brush grew thick and the rocks formed narrow passages. I squeezed through gaps between boulders, climbed over obstacles that forced them to find alternate routes, used every trick I had learned to create distance between us. Finally, after what seemed like hours but was probably less than one, I lost them. I huddled in a crevice between rocks, my chest heaving, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear, and I listened to the sounds of their search growing fainter as they moved away from my position. When I was certain they were gone, I emerged and made my way back towards my shelter, moving with extreme caution, taking a circuitous route to ensure I was not followed. I did not return to that farm again. I found other sources of food, ranging farther afield, accepting longer periods of hunger rather than risking another encounter with the hunters. The experience had shaken me, had reminded me that the test was real, that failure was possible, that I could still lose everything if I grew careless. The hardest part of the cryptire was not the hunger or the danger, but the loneliness. I had lived surrounded by others for 7 years, my existence defined by the collective, my identity formed through comparison and competition with my companions. Now I was alone, truly alone for the first time in my memory, and the silence of that aloneness was more oppressive than any punishment I had endured in the agoge. I found myself thinking about my mother, something I had not allowed myself to do in years. I wondered if she thought of me, if she knew what I was enduring, if she had any sense of whether I had survived or perished. But these thoughts were dangerous, were weakness asserting itself through the cracks in my discipline, and I pushed them away, focused instead on the immediate demands of survival. I marked the passage of days by cutting notches into a stick I had found, 1 notch for each sunrise. When the stick showed 20 notches, I knew I was 2/3 through the test, and I allowed myself to feel a cautious hope that I might complete it successfully. But hope too was dangerous, was a form of complacency that might lead to mistakes, and I suppressed it as I had suppressed all other emotions. On the 27th day, I encountered something that nearly ended my test prematurely. I had ventured into an area I had not previously explored, drawn by the possibility of finding a new source of food. As I moved through a narrow ravine, I heard a sound that made my blood freeze, the unmistakable hiss of a serpent disturbed from its rest. The creature was coiled on a rock ledge above me, its body thick and its head raised in warning. I froze, knowing that any sudden movement might trigger an attack, and I slowly, carefully, began to back away. The serpent watched me, its tongue flickering, its body tense with readiness. I took one step backwards, then another, my eyes never leaving the creature, my breathing shallow and controlled. When I had put sufficient distance between us, I turned and moved away quickly, my heart pounding with the realization of how close I had come to disaster. A bite from such a creature would have meant the end of my test, either through the venom itself or through the necessity of seeking help, which would have constituted failure. I was more careful after that, more attentive to my surroundings, more aware that danger could come from sources other than human hunters. The wilderness was not empty. It was populated with creatures that had their own claims to the space, their own reasons for defending their territory, and I was an intruder in their domain. The final 3 days of the test passed slowly. I was exhausted by then, worn down by weeks of inadequate food and constant vigilance. My body had grown thinner, my ribs visible beneath the skin, my face gaunt and hollow. But I had survived, and survival was all that mattered. On the 30th day, at dawn, I returned to the place where I had been left. The same older boy who had brought me was waiting there, along with several others who had also completed the test. We stood in a line, silent and exhausted, waiting for the judgment that would determine our fates. The Paidonomos arrived as the sun cleared the horizon. He walked along our line, examining each of us, his face revealing nothing of his thoughts. When he had completed his inspection, he nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement that we had proven ourselves worthy. We were led back to the training ground, where we were given food and water and time to rest. But even as I ate and felt strength returning to my body, I knew that this was only one test among many, that the agoge would continue to test us until we either emerged as full warriors or were found wanting and cast aside. I had survived the cryptire. I had proven that I could function alone, could endure hardship without the structure of the collective to sustain me. But I had also learned something unexpected, that the loneliness of independence was harder to bear than the harsh discipline of communal training. I had learned that I needed my brothers in arms, needed the unspoken support of those who suffered alongside me, needed the bonds that formed between warriors more than I needed individual glory. This was perhaps the true lesson of the cryptire, that strength came not from isolation, but from knowing that one could survive alone if necessary, whilst choosing to remain part of the collective, because that was where true power resided. A single warrior, no matter how skilled, could be defeated, but warriors bound together, functioning as one, were nearly invincible. The years that followed the cryptire were years of refinement, of taking the raw material that had been forged through childhood and adolescence and honing it to a finer edge. We were no longer boys, though we had not yet been granted the full status of warriors. We existed in a liminal space, proven capable but not yet tested in true combat, skilled but not yet masters of our craft. The training intensified in ways I had not thought possible. What had seemed brutal in our earlier years now appeared almost gentle in comparison to what was demanded of us. We trained with full weapons now, proper spears and shields of bronze, and the weight of them was greater than the training staves we had grown accustomed to. We had to develop new strength, new endurance, new techniques for wielding equipment that could end a life as easily as it could preserve one. The shield particularly required adjustment. It was large and heavy, designed to protect not only the bearer but the man beside him, and carrying it required strength in the left arm and shoulder that took months to develop fully. We drilled in formation constantly, learning to maintain the shield wall, to advance and retreat in perfect unison, to present an impenetrable barrier to any enemy who might face us. These drills were not abstract exercises. We were told stories of battles that Sparta had fought, of enemies who had broken themselves against Spartan shields. of victories won through discipline and cohesion when individual skill might have failed. We were being prepared not merely to fight, but to be part of something larger than ourselves, to function as cells within a single organism that moved and struck with unified purpose. But the most profound transformation during these years was internal rather than external. Something shifted within us, something that had been slowly building throughout our time in the agoge, and finally crystallized into a new understanding of who and what we were. We had begun as individuals, separate boys with our own histories and personalities and ways of being. The agoge had stripped away much of that individuality, had forced us into a common mold, had taught us to suppress personal desire in favor of collective need. But suppression is not elimination, and beneath the hardened exterior we presented to the world, we remained individual souls, still capable of thought and feeling and doubt. The battle within was the struggle to reconcile these two aspects of ourselves, the individual and the collective, the personal will and the state's demand. Some never successfully completed this reconciliation. They went through the motions of training, performed adequately in exercises, but something essential remained unintegrated, some core of resistance that prevented full transformation. These were the ones who failed the final tests, who proved unable to function effectively when true danger threatened. They had learned the techniques but not the underlying philosophy. They could execute movements but not embody the spirit that made those movements effective. And they were removed, quietly and without ceremony. Their presence among us ended as so many presences had ended before. I struggled with this battle myself. There were nights when I lay on my pallet and questioned everything I had become, wondered whether the transformation was worth the cost, whether I had lost something essential in the process of gaining what Sparta valued. I thought about Polemarchus, about his gentleness that had been judged as weakness, and I wondered whether he had been right to hold on to that part of himself, even though it meant his removal from the agoge. But these doubts were luxuries I could not afford. The path I had chosen, or that had been chosen for me, led in only one direction. I could complete the journey or I could fail, but I could not turn back. So I pushed the doubts down, buried them beneath layers of discipline and determination, and I continued forward because forward was the only direction available. The turning point came during a training exercise in my 16th year. We were divided into two groups and told to fight one another with spears, not the dulled training weapons we had used before, but real spears, their points sharp enough to penetrate flesh. The exercise was meant to simulate actual combat, to teach us what it felt like to face an enemy who genuinely threatened our lives. I was placed in the front rank of my group, shield held before me, spear gripped firmly in my right hand. Across the field, I could see the opposing group forming their own line, their faces set with concentration and determination. We had trained together for years, had eaten and slept and suffered alongside one another, and now we were being asked to fight as though they were enemies, to drive our weapons towards them with intent. The command was given, and we advanced. The shield wall moved forward as a single unit, each man maintaining his position relative to those beside him, our feet stepping in rhythm, our shields overlapping to present an unbroken barrier. The opposing line advanced to meet us, and the two formations collided with a sound like thunder, bronze clashing against bronze, men shouting despite their training, the order beginning to dissolve into chaos. A spear thrust towards my face, and I deflected it with my shield, feeling the impact shudder through my arm. I drove my own spear forward, aiming for the gap between my opponent's shield and body, and I felt the point strike something, heard a cry that might have been pain or anger or both. I could not see whether I had caused injury, could not pause to assess, because another attack was already coming from a different direction. The fighting continued for what might have been moments or hours, time losing its normal measure in the intensity of combat. I was aware only of immediate threats, of points seeking to penetrate my defences, of the need to maintain my position in the line, to protect the man beside me even as I defended myself. My mind emptied of everything except the present moment, the continuous flow of threat and response, strike and parry, advance and defend. And then, in the midst of that chaos, something shifted within me. The internal struggle, the battle between who I had been and who Sparta needed me to become, suddenly resolved itself. I stopped thinking, stopped questioning, stopped experiencing myself as separate from my actions. I simply was the actions themselves, was the shield and the spear and the unwavering line, was the collective made flesh, was Sparta's will embodied in muscle and bone and bronze. When the exercise ended, when the commanders called us to halt and we separated into our respective groups, I found that I was trembling, not with fear or exhaustion, but with a strange exhilaration. I had discovered something during that fight, had touched something that existed beyond words or rational understanding. I had experienced what it meant to be truly Spartan, to function without doubt or hesitation, to be so completely integrated into the collective that individual identity dissolved into pure action. Not all my companions reached this point. Some continued to struggle, continued to fight the internal battle even as they fought external enemies. But those of us who achieved the integration, who completed the transformation, became different. We moved differently, fought differently, existed differently in the world. We had become what the agoge had always been designed to create, living weapons whose individual wills were perfectly aligned with the state's purpose. This transformation did not make us inhuman, though from the outside it might have appeared so. We still felt pain, still experienced fear, still formed attachments and suffered losses. But these experiences no longer controlled us. They existed as background noise, acknowledged but not permitted to interfere with function. We had learned to observe our own emotions with detachment, to recognize them without being swayed by them, to remain clear-headed and effective even when circumstances would have justified panic or despair. The price of this transformation was high. We had surrendered something that most men held precious, the illusion of individual autonomy, the belief that one's life belonged to oneself alone. We had acknowledged that we were instruments, tools to be employed in service of something greater than ourselves, and we had accepted that acknowledgement willingly because we understood that it was necessary, that Sparta's survival depended upon warriors who could function in this way. Were we happy? The question seems almost meaningless. Happiness was not a concept that held much relevance in Spartan life. We experienced satisfaction when we performed well, pride when we proved ourselves worthy, relief when difficult ordeals ended. But happiness in the sense that other peoples understood it, the pursuit of pleasure and comfort and personal fulfillment, was foreign to us, almost incomprehensible. We had been shaped for a different purpose. We existed to defend our city, to preserve our way of life, to stand as a barrier between Sparta and all that threatened it. This purpose gave meaning to our existence, even if it did not grant happiness. And perhaps meaning mattered more than happiness. Perhaps the knowledge that one's life served a vital function was sufficient compensation for all that had been sacrificed to achieve that function. There were those who did not complete the transformation, whose names became silence, whose pallets were taken away in the depth of night, leaving only empty spaces where companions had been. I have spoken of some who departed earlier, but in these final years of the agoge, the departures took on a different character, heavier somehow, more final. We were older now, no longer children but young men on the threshold of full warrior status. Those who failed at this stage had endured years of brutal training, had survived ordeals that would have broken most men, had come so close to achieving the goal that its loss must have been almost unbearable. Yet they failed nonetheless, for reasons that were never fully explained to those of us who remained. Aristodemus was among them, he who had been so clever at stealing, who had moved through shadows with the grace of a hunting cat, who had survived the crypteia and returned lean and proud. He fell away in our 18th year, removed not for lack of physical capability, but for something more subtle, some quality of spirit that the instructors judged inadequate. I never learned what specific failing had marked him for removal. Perhaps he had hesitated in some crucial moment. Perhaps he had shown compassion when ruthlessness was required. Perhaps he had simply failed to complete the internal transformation, had remained too much himself and not enough a part of the collective. Whatever the reason, he was gone, and we did not speak of him, and after a time it became difficult to remember exactly what he had looked like, or how his voice had sounded. This forgetting was not accidental. We were taught to let go of those who departed, to sever the bonds of companionship as cleanly as one might sever a rope with a sharp blade. To dwell upon those who were gone was to question the judgment that had removed them, and to question that judgment was to question the entire system that had shaped us. Better to forget, to focus upon those who remained, to continue the forward movement that had defined our existence since the day we entered the agoge. But forgetting was not as easy as the instructors implied it should be. The ghosts of departed companions lingered in the spaces they had occupied, in the rhythms of training that had been calibrated to include them, in the memories that surfaced unexpectedly despite our efforts to suppress them. I would find myself turning to speak to someone who was no longer there, or anticipating the presence of a companion who had vanished weeks before, and each time this happened, I felt a small wound opening, quickly sealed but leaving its mark nonetheless. The final year of the agoge was the hardest, not because the physical demands increased, though they did, but because we were forced to confront the reality that some among us would not reach the end. We had been together for more than a decade, had shared ordeals that bound us more tightly than blood kinship, had become brothers in every sense except the biological. Yet Sparta demanded that we hold these bonds lightly, that we be prepared to see our brothers removed without protest or grief. There was a boy named Demonicus who I had known since our first year. He was not remarkable in any particular way, not the strongest or fastest or most skilled, but he was steady, reliable, the kind of companion one valued for his consistency rather than brilliance. We had stood beside one another in countless formations, had shared stolen food during hungry times, had helped each other through moments of weakness that neither of us acknowledged aloud. In the final months before our completion of the agoge, Demonicus began to change. I noticed it first in small ways, a certain slowness in his movements, a distance in his eyes, as though part of him had already departed even whilst his body remained present. He continued to train, continued to perform his duties, but the vitality that had characterized him began to fade, replaced by something that looked like resignation, or perhaps despair. I tried to help him in the limited ways that were available to me. I positioned myself beside him during formations, lending my strength to compensate for his flagging energy. I shared my food rations more generously, hoping that better nourishment might restore whatever was failing in him. I even spoke to him once, a rare violation of our normal silence, asking if he was well, if there was anything I could do. He looked at me for a long moment, and I saw in his eyes a weariness that went deeper than physical exhaustion. He said nothing, only shook his head slightly, and I understood that whatever battle he was fighting was one that I could not help him win. It was internal, private, beyond the reach of companionship or external support. 2 weeks before our graduation ceremony, Demonicus was removed. I woke one morning to find his pallet empty, his few possessions gone, no trace remaining that he had ever occupied that space. The older boy who supervised our barrack said nothing about his absence, and we knew better than to ask. We simply closed the gap in our formation, adjusted to his absence, and continued as though nothing had changed. But something had changed, for me at least. Demonicus had been one of the last links to my earliest years in the agoge, one of the few who had been present from the beginning, and had seemed likely to reach the end. His removal so close to completion felt cruel, in a way that earlier departures had not, a waste of all the suffering he had endured, all the years he had given to the pursuit of a goal he would now never achieve. I wondered where he had gone, what became of boys who were removed from the agoge. Did they return to ordinary life in Sparta, taking up trades or farming, forever marked by their failure to complete the training? Did they leave the city entirely, seeking lives elsewhere, carrying their shame like a visible brand? Or did they simply cease to exist, their names truly becoming silence, their fates unknown even to those who had called them brothers? These questions had no answers, or if they did, the answers were kept from us deliberately. We were meant to focus only on success, on the completion of our own transformation, not on the fate of those who fell away. Yet I could not entirely suppress the questions, could not prevent myself from wondering whether Demonicus thought of us sometimes, whether he remembered the years we had spent together, whether he judged himself harshly for his failure, or had found some measure of peace in whatever life he now led. The departures were not always quiet disappearances in the night. Some were more dramatic, more public, serving as lessons to those who remained. I witnessed such a lesson in my 17th year, though the details of it remain painful to recount even now, decades later. A boy whose name I shall not speak was discovered to have violated one of the fundamental laws of the agoge. The nature of his violation was never fully explained to us, only that it involved a breach of discipline so severe that mere removal was considered insufficient punishment. He was brought before all of us, made to stand in the centre of the training ground whilst the Paidonamos pronounced judgment. What followed served as a demonstration of what Sparta did with those who betrayed the trust placed in them. The boy was not harmed physically, but he was stripped of everything that identified him as Spartan, his tunic removed and replaced with rags, his head shaved, his name declared void. He was then led from the training ground by older warriors, taken we knew not where, his fate sealed by the judgment that had been pronounced. We watched in silence, and the silence was heavy with understanding. This was what awaited anyone who placed personal desire above collective duty, who broke the bonds of discipline that held Sparta together. The punishment was not meant to be merciful. It was meant to be absolute, to erase the offender so completely that even his memory became a warning rather than a person. After that demonstration, we were even more careful, even more vigilant about maintaining discipline, about ensuring that nothing we did could be interpreted as disloyalty or weakness. The fear of such a fate was more effective than any amount of physical punishment could have been. We had seen what happened when the state withdrew its favour, and we understood that our entire existence depended upon maintaining that favour through perfect adherence to what was demanded of us. Yet even in the midst of this fear, even as we watched companions depart and understood that we might be next, we continued to find ways to support one another, to maintain the bonds that made our existence bearable. These bonds had to be concealed more carefully now, had to be expressed only in the subtlest ways, but they persisted because we needed them, because without them, we would have been truly alone in a system that acknowledged no individual worth. The lesson of the departed was clear. Sparta would take everything from us and give nothing in return.